the preeminent example in all of history of a place that does that. So much so that I think we've forgotten to look at the sort of white circles, if you like. So we've just sort of taken it as implicit that the economy was going to supply us food and water and shelter and the resources to raise our kids. And I think that that's really the thing we need to focus on now, is trying to find that integrated solution that's characteristic of ecology, that actually finds the joint solution for all of those requirements while still maintaining our dedication to the sort of special lifestyle that is the urban lifestyle. And so at the end of my book, I make some very speculative kind of thought experiments about this, that take a city block like Madison Square Park and imagine it without the cars, but bringing back the streetcars and the people walking and streams and forests, big trees, and start to actually generate energy in the city today. What's solely amazing and great is that out there in the urban planning literature, in the architecture, some of the people that will talk to us today, there are great ideas about how to make cities work in these fundamental forms. Whether we imagine the Upper East Side as it is today, but wet it over with green roofs and with streams going through the cities again, and that we start to see the city not only as a city that's self-governed, but actually sits within a region. And this is a complete thought experiment. Please don't take offense. And imagine it over a 400-year process to be determined. But our idea was, what if everybody in this image, around 12 million people, lived at the density of Manhattan? Then they would live in only 36% of the area. So even if we raise the water up a meter to try and reflect climate change, you could make this landscape look like this instead. You could restore some of the old fields that used to supply the city. You know, New York, for most of its history, didn't get food from California or from South America. It actually got it from Queens and from Brooklyn and from the Bronx. So we bring that back again, as well as to restore the habitats that will make the estuary work, the salt marshes around the city, and in fact make a city that sits in its region, that sits on a planet that works for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You certainly did capture our imagination in a very strikingly, visually way. I'm sure there will be many questions, so please raise your hands and we have a few minutes for questions.
Sorry, I can't really see you, but go ahead.
You used the phrase several times, as it might have been. Now, how do you find the tension between how it was and how it might have been, the implications?
I think you can address that more specifically than me. What I will say is that it's already happening, right? The Blue Belt on Staten Island is a place that the city has defined as a place that can happen. There's some work going on in the Yonkers that can make that happen. Similarly, not so much daylighting, but actually restoring our waterways. The work that's been happening for the last 30 years in the Bronx River is really a remarkable example of an urban restoration of a river that's creating new habitat. So much so that 2 years ago a beaver showed up in the Bronx River. So it's one of the great things about nature is that it constantly surprises you. If you give it just half a chance, something's going to get in there and try and take advantage of it. So, and often way beyond what we might think.
Yeah, I read that when there's a weeping willow tree, it's an indication that there's an underground water source. Is that true?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
I read that if you see a weeping willow tree, like there's some down in the East Village, that it's an indication that there's an underground water source. Is that true? And is that one of the things that you would look for when you're making your project?
Well, it's certainly true that willows are a water-dependent species. You tend to see them associated with water, and there were, I think, 6 different kinds of willows that were once on Manhattan Island. I'm not sure if weeping willow, I think that's actually.
David Berg, Long Metro. Within the last couple months, the city's given a permit to develop one of the last natural outflowing springs on Staten Island. Just one example of many really special natural places that were $5, many of which have recently been or are currently under attack. Do you see your project as able to lend itself to that? I see looking at the regional picture. those are much more controversial day-to-day land use issues. Do you see some relevance there?
You know, I think there's two parts of that. I mean, one, our project helps put that particular place or the other sort of remnant natural areas in the city into context. Actually gives you sort of a larger sense of how springs work in the city and helps people understand why springs might be important and why they might be something that we want to conserve. But I also think, as we think about this over the long term, that we really need, as we talk about the environment in New York City, to be thinking over a 100-year time frame or a 400-year time frame, and thinking not just about finding little pockets of nature that we're going to save and protect and sort of block out, but actually thinking about how do we restore ecosystem processes and ecosystem structures across the entire landscape. In some cases, that's going to be about conserving things that exist today, but in other cases, it's going to be about recreating the conditions to make those new habitats and processes possible.
Jean Gardner from Parsons. First, I just want to thank you. This is the most extraordinary project at such a critical moment. And my concern is the lack of understanding politically of these ecological processes. And I'm just wondering if you've seen any glimmer of that level of understanding, because as you say, it's not just an individual place. We really have to look at the overall dynamic, and I would imagine that these underlying ecologies have changed over 400 years. So we can't just, undo. We have to have the imagination to see how our presence in the soil community has led to something that we can't even imagine. So I'm just curious if you've seen any evidence of this actually in operation.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and thanks for that. I guess what I would say is that, Monahawk is not about, let's restore it exactly back to what this was. It's more what you're talking about before, which is opening up the conversation. And I think words like change and modification are the right words to use. And we need to inform that. We need to inform that as sort of academic researchers, and we need to inform that as sort of activist members of society. And I am seeing evidence of it. I mean, Plan NYC is an example of that. The Regional Plan Association in New York is doing some great things. I don't know if you've been following the plans for Governor's Island, but there's some really very interesting things going on there. And I think, moreover, we're getting to a point where people of sort of my generation who grew up with Sesame Street, who grew up with ecology, are becoming people that get to make decisions. And I think that's also changing. So, and I think you're totally right. It's really important that it's happening now, because it may not be the highest priority over the next year or the next 4 years, but what is the highest priority over the 21st century? It's to figure out how we're going to get so many people to live on planet Earth and for the rest of planet Earth to be able to support us and support everything else that lives here.
Eric, you talk a lot about the tidal wetlands in Manhattan, but especially with all of the invitations to Queens and to Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Can you briefly say what its role was and what its role could be?
Yeah.
The immensity of all of those salt marshes really is astonishing.
Yeah. So, and I should be careful with I wrote my PhD about tidal marshes. I can go on and on, but I won't do that for this thing, don't worry. They are really essential ecosystems. And on Manhattan specifically, about 25% of the island was originally wetlands of one kind or another, and about half of those were salt marshes, to give you an idea. Human beings all through time have had an effect on the landscape. Therefore, building skyscrapers and roads and driving my car is all totally fine, because that's just what human beings do, and that's natural for human beings to do. And I think that can be a very kind of simple-minded way of thinking about it. Because of course, a wigwam and a fire is very different than a skyscraper and a paved road, right? I think we need to bring the same kind of nuance when we think about plant species or other kind of biological introductions. That there is a process by which species move around the world, and that's sometimes facilitated by other organisms, including by people. And yet, some of the organisms that we insert have very big consequences for everything else, right? So we might introduce, starlings, and there might be then 60 million starlings that are actually pushing out other species because they're a superior competitor. And they do provide some sort of ecosystem services. Hawks eat starlings, if you like. That doesn't mean